Hello and welcome. I'm Julia, and today we are talking about assumptions in reading comp passages for the GMAT. Assumption questions aren't as common in reading comp as they are in critical reasoning, but anywhere there are opinions and supporting evidence, there will be assumptions involved. RC passages are also longer than critical reasoning arguments, and they often involve multiple conclusions that may or may not agree with each other. So though the skills are similar, the application is just a bit different. Let's look at a passage and a few assumption questions so you can get a feel for that difference. Here is our assumption passage. Renewable energy sources have gained significant traction in recent decades as alternatives to fossil fuels. Proponents of renewable energy argue that since renewable sources such as solar and wind power produce minimal greenhouse gas emissions during operation, their widespread adoption would significantly reduce global carbon emissions. They further contend that because the cost of renewable technologies have decreased dramatically in recent years, renewable energy is now economically competitive with conventional energy sources in many markets. Critics, however, maintain that since renewable energy sources are intermittent, the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, they cannot reliably meet baseline energy demands without substantial investments in energy storage technologies. These critics suggest that the environmental benefits of renewable energy are overstated, as the manufacturing and disposal of components such as solar panels and wind turbines involve processes that generate significant pollution. Some economists argue that because renewable energy projects often require substantial government subsidies to be financially viable, their rapid expansion distorts energy markets and ultimately leads to higher costs for consumers. They claim that since these subsidies divert resources from other potentially beneficial investments, the opportunity costs of renewable energy transitions are frequently overlooked in policy discussions. Renewable energy advocates counter that fossil fuel industries have historically received and continue to receive substantial government support through direct subsidies and indirect benefits such as not being required to pay for environmental externalities. They assert that when all costs are properly accounted for, including environmental and health impacts, renewable energy sources are already more economically advantageous than fossil fuels in most contexts. Question 1. The proponent's argument that renewable energy, quote unquote, would significantly reduce global carbon emissions is based on which of the following assumptions? There are a lot of opinions based on an assortment of evidence in this passage. Helpfully, the question gives us the conclusion that we need to support. However, a conclusion is just one half of the assumption bridge, so we need to find the other half. The evidence that supports this conclusion that widespread adoption would significantly reduce global carbon emissions is here slightly above. Since renewable sources such as solar and wind power produce minimal greenhouse gas emissions during operation. Let's look at our answers and see which one seems like a bridge between those two. A. The carbon emissions produced during the manufacturing of renewable energy equipment are negligible compared to the emissions saved during operation. If we negate A and the carbon emissions produced during the manufacturing of renewable energy equipment are not negligible compared to the emissions saved during operation, then the proponent's conclusion that widespread adoption would significantly reduce global carbon emissions isn't supported. If manufacturing emissions were actually significant compared to operational savings, then widespread adoption might not significantly reduce overall emissions at all. Let's look at the others. B. Government subsidies for renewable energy will continue to increase in the coming years. If we negate that, it doesn't really hurt this conclusion. C. The intermittent nature of renewable energy sources can be overcome through technological innovation. This part isn't about the intermittent nature, that is mentioned later. D, most countries have committed to reducing their carbon emissions through international agreements. We aren't concerned with that right now. And E, the cost of renewable energy technologies will continue to decrease at the current rate. This one isn't about costs. So our best answer is A. Perfect. Next question. Question 2. The economist's assertion that government subsidies for renewable energy ultimately leads to higher costs for consumers assumes which of the following? Let's find our conclusion, which is here, and let's find how it's supported, which is here. Because renewable energy projects often require substantial government subsidies to be financially viable, their rapid expansion distorts energy markets and ultimately leads to higher costs for consumers. Let's go through our options. A, renewable energy technologies will never achieve the same efficiency as fossil fuel technologies. This is about parity, and we're talking about cost for consumers. B, governments typically raise taxes to fund renewable energy subsidies. This one's kind of tempting, but it's not a necessary assumption for the first part, the premise, to lead to the conclusion, because there could be other reasons going on. It doesn't have to be through how the governments are funding these subsidies. C, consumers are generally unwilling to pay premium prices for clean energy. This one isn't about consumer preference, so C isn't helpful to us. D, the market distortions created by subsidies outweigh the potential cost reductions achieved through increased scale and technological improvements. So if we negate D and the distortions do not outweigh potential cost reductions, then our conclusion no longer follows from the evidence, because those subsidies would be leading to increased scale, and even though they're distorting the market, that doesn't lead to higher cost for consumers. E, energy companies do not pass cost savings from subsidies onto consumers. E is about company behavior, but the conclusion is about broader market distortions. So negating E doesn't necessarily make the conclusion invalid. I'm thinking D. Perfect. One more question. The critics' argument that the environmental benefits of renewable energy are overstated assumes which of the following? Let's find this quote, and it's here. And then how is it supported? Here. The environmental benefits of renewable energy are overstated as the manufacturing and disposal of components such as solar panels and wind turbines involve processes that generate significant pollution. Let's go through our answers. A, public perception of renewable energy is primarily shaped by environmental advocacy groups. We are talking about environmental benefits, the actual environmental benefits, not public perception. B, the intermittent nature of renewable energy sources necessitates maintaining fossil fuel plants as backup. The critics do talk about this, but it's not related to the claim that we're actually looking at about overstated benefits. C, technological improvements will not significantly reduce the environmental impact of manufacturing renewable energy components. C is about the future, and we're actually talking about the present, so we aren't concerned with that. D, environmental impact assessments of energy sources typically focus only on operational emissions. So this is saying that the environmental benefits might be mismeasured, but we're talking about the real environmental benefits. So a measuring error wouldn't matter. And E, the life cycle pollution of renewable energy technologies is significant enough to offset their operational environmental advantages. If the pollution created in the life cycle of renewable energy tech was not significant enough to offset the operational advantages, then the conclusion that the benefits are overstated doesn't follow from the premise that manufacturing and disposal of necessary components of the life cycle generate significant pollution to make the environmental benefits of renewable energy overstated. So, E is necessary. Connecting the right premises to the right conclusion is very important for these assumption questions, especially in a passage like this that just has so many conclusions going on. So that is the main focus that I would have when trying to work on assumptions in RC, is to make sure that you're finding the right bridge that you need to gap. Okay, how do you feel about that? These questions are pretty similar to other assumption questions, but you have to be more careful about finding the right evidence to tie to the conclusion that the question is talking about. Noticing the many conclusions in your reading comp passages is great practice for this. So always look for conclusion or opinion markers, words such as so-and-so argues or somebody claims something, and it will be easier to see the plethora of conclusions that might be presented. See you next time.